Hello there, welcome to the third of three online Lenten video series and our theme on the lives of the saints. In the first video, I talked a little bit about the history of the development of the understanding of sainthood within the Church of England and the Episcopal Church. In the second video, I talked a little bit about some of the politics of sainthood, who we commemorate and how we choose certain saints to commemorate can often tell us as much about ourselves as it does about the lives of the people we honor. And here in this third video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the current state of the saints calendar in the Episcopal Church and do a little schoolhouse rock understanding of government and let you all know, how do you get to be a saint in the Episcopal Church? So first things first, a little bit about the current state of the worship calendar in the Episcopal Church. As I mentioned in my first video, at the time of the Reformation in the 16th century, in the 1500s, the Church of England removed almost all of the saints' commemorations from the medieval church. If you look at the calendar of saints in the medieval church, almost 1 out of every 3 or 4 days was some kind of saint's day or some kind of saint's commemoration. The lives of the saints and celebrating the saints were woven into the fabric of day-to-day life in the medieval church. So at the Reformation, the Church of England removed 90% of these saints' commemorations, tried to limit it to only those saint commemorations that could be proven from the Bible or evident throughout church history, with 2 exceptions, one being St. George and the Dragon. England just couldn't give up St. George, who was the patron saint of England. And that's how it stayed for hundreds and hundreds of years. Very few commemorations were added. Remembering and celebrating the lives of the saints was not a very big part of the devotional life of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican world by and large. When the 1928 Book of Common Prayer was produced, the edition prior to the one that is authorized currently in the Episcopal Church, the last major revision in 1928, still only had 21 saints' days commemorated, hardly added maybe 1 or 2 over the prior calendar. So going into the middle of the 20th century, the commemoration or remembering of the lives of saints was not a big part of the worship or devotional life of Anglicanism. Things started to change rapidly in the 1950s and the 1960s. There's a greater appreciation and understanding and an effort to try and reclaim some of the historic aspects and elements of the life of the church. So starting in the 1950s and the 1960s, a committee sat down to try and figure out how to broaden the calendar of saints and the calendar of commemorations. So by the time that the 1979 Book of Common Prayer came around, the number of commemorations had moved from just 21 for the 1928 Book of Common Prayer up to almost 120 that were included on the calendar of the church in the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, with each one of these saints having a prayer of the day appropriate to them, and specific readings picked and selected to try and reflect what we feel the scriptural passages that are relevant to the life or the witness of that saint. In the 1980s and the 1990s and in the 2000s, the calendar of commemorations expanded dramatically. So that by the late 2000s, one of the last major revisions to be produced was produced in 2009. It had gone up to 271 different commemorations in the Episcopal Church, leaving almost going right back to the medieval era, where almost every day was some kind of saint's day or saint's commemoration. Most of these not major saints, not biblical figures or apostles, but other folks chosen throughout the history of the church. And there was a sense after the 2009 revision that the calendar had gotten a little too big or a little too crowded. So the last 10 years has been a number of different types of efforts to try and trim down the calendar of saints, to try and set out some more guidelines. There had been some confusion at some point as to perhaps who was most appropriate to be a saint. I'll give you an example. One of the commemorations that was added in the 2000s was John Calvin to the calendar of saints. John Calvin was the founder of what's now the Presbyterian Church. Most Reformed churches, Presbyterian churches, draw their legacy from Calvin. And some folks thought that choosing Calvin kind of exemplified this confusion around why are we commemorating what we are commemorating. For one thing, Presbyterians don't commemorate saints in the same way. So even within Calvin's own tradition, he was not remembered as a saint in that kind of way. And also Calvin himself asked to be buried in an unmarked grave because he specifically did not want anyone to remember or commemorate or venerate him. He saw himself as just another person, just another human being. So many folks asked, why are we commemorating someone whose own tradition has commemorated him in this way, and who he himself did not want to be remembered or venerated in that way? Who are we remembering Calvin for? For Calvin, for us, for some other kinds of reasons? So there was a lot of questions around the calendar of saints as it came out in 2009 at that last major revision. Long story short, a number of different options and proposals were debated and discussed in the 2000s, in 2012 and in 2015. So eventually in 2018, the current calendar of the Episcopal Church came out. The General Convention of the Episcopal Church, which meets once every 3 years, and which is the highest governing body, is the one that approves the calendar of commemorations. At the 2018 General Convention, the current calendar of saints was issued, and it was an effort to create some compromise. It trimmed it back to about 210 commemorations, still a lot, but not as many. It trimmed back almost 70 or 80 commemorations from the previous round. And it also tried to allow for options for local commemoration, that to try and break down this notion that either you're commemorated on the national calendar of the church or you don't get commemorated at all, to allow for more flexibility and to allow for more kinds of local and regional ways to commemorate people who might be very, very important in a particular local context. So the current calendar of the Episcopal Church, which came out in 2018, has 210 commemorations. We remember a lot of the big ones, like the Apostles, Feasts of Jesus, Feasts of Mary, but it also remembers to commemorate significant people in the life of the Church. The Reverend Polly Murray, the first African-American woman ordained in the Episcopal Church, Florence Lee Tim Oy, the first woman ordained in the Anglican Communion. It remembers folks from the 20th century and remembers folks from some of our more recent history and more recent tradition. So that's the current state of the calendar. So now let's get to the how does a bill become a law, civics version of this for the church. How do you get to be a saint in the Episcopal Church? The short answer is anyone can become a saint, and we're the ones that decide. The church itself decides. There's a couple of phases to this. First of all, according to the Book of Common Prayer, anyone can commemorate anybody. There are, for lack of a better word, generic prayers in the Episcopal Church's Book of Common Prayer on pages 246 and 250 that offer a sort of general prayer for a particular person and a generic kind of set of readings. So for any martyr, anyone you might consider a martyr, anyone you might consider a prophet, anyone you might consider a monastic, that can be used to commemorate someone who may not have a particular date of commemoration on the calendar. So anyone can be remembered in a local context, and there are prayers and readings that can be used in that kind of context. And the key is, in the Episcopal Church, is who we choose to remember and put on our calendar of saints is supposed to bubble up from the bottom. This is how it worked in the first centuries of Christianity, when there was no formal process. Things would bubble up from the bottom and folks would be commemorated locally, and then that commemoration would spread. So what first happens in the Episcopal Church is someone is usually remembered locally, in a particular diocese or in a particular geographic area or groupings. And here's a good example. Deaconess Harriet Bedell. The Episcopal Church had an order of deaconesses, which existed prior until women could be ordained to the priesthood. And Harriet Bedell was a deaconess. They were consecrated to ministries of word and service. And she lived in South Florida and was one of the actively involved in preservation of the Everglades and environmentalism, and began to be remembered and commemorated in South Florida, in the diocese there, and in congregations there. And eventually that local commemoration began to spread, and it began to move up to the next level. So the first level is local commemoration, and the next level is if someone is proposed to be put on the calendar of the church, the formal liturgical calendar of the worship calendar of the church. And that can only be done by the General Convention. The General Convention of the Episcopal Church is the highest governing body. It meets once every 3 years. It has all bishops are members, but each diocese also elects clergy and lay members of General Convention. And at any General Convention, the General Convention can consider persons put forward for the liturgical calendar of the church. And there are several criteria for that. One of my favorites is they're supposed to be historical. They're supposed to actually have lived. Unfortunately, over the centuries, some saints have come to be remembered and commemorated that probably didn't exist. St. Christopher is one of the probably more common examples. Is the saint of the Roman Catholic Church you pray to. If you lose something, you pray to find it. St. Christopher has been kind of desainted because there's really not a lot of historical evidence that he existed. And we can say that about some other saints on the calendar as well. So that's one criterion in the Episcopal Church. It has to be a historical figure. They had to have lived lives, extraordinary lives of discipleship. Doesn't exactly define what that means, but these need to be extraordinary individuals who exemplify what it meant to live the Christian life. Another criterion is the calendar should be broadly inclusive. It should try and include men and women. It should try and include ordained and lay persons. It should try and include persons from the broad swath of the history of the church, not just everyone modern or not just everyone ancient. It should be as inclusive as possible. And here's an important one. There should be, one of the other categories is perspective. The guidelines say there should have been at least 2 generations or 50 years have passed since the person died. Because society may change, some of the things we may value in someone we may not value 50 or 60 years later. There's perspective that one gains. And frankly, it can take 2 generations or 50 years when we learn, sadly, sometimes different kind of details about someone's life that we may have not known at the time, that may impact or that may shape how we remember and view that person. So if you do that, you submit a resolution to the General Convention, which includes some suggested prayers for that person, and it goes to the General Convention. General Convention has 2 houses. It's a bicameral body. It has a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. And it goes to the floor, and people vote on it. And anyone can, it's kind of like going to town meeting or watching them debate bills in Congress where anyone can amend it. One quick story as we start to wind down this video. I was in the General Convention. I worked for the Office of the Presiding Bishop for 10 years as ecumenical and interreligious officer, coordinating the Episcopal Church's relationships with other Christian churches and with other religious groups and organizations. And as part of that, I would often be a resource to visitors from other Christian traditions or from other faith traditions who would come as guests to General Convention. And so at one of the General Conventions, I was sitting at the table in the section set aside for the ecumenical visitors. And I was sitting next to this Roman Catholic Archbishop. And they were debating a certain commemoration. And so the commemoration was on the floor. This was in the House of Deputies. These are deacons and priests or lay people, 50-50, 50% clergy, 50% laity. And they're debating whether this person should be added to the commemoration of the church. And I'll never forget, one person stood up and said, for the reading that's assigned for this commemoration, I'd like to amend and extend that reading by 4 verses, and then proceeded to explain why they were proposing that. It was debated and passed. Roman Catholic Archbishop leans over to me and says, "This is the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life." He said, "We can't translate the Lord's Prayer from Latin into English without the Vatican approving it. But here, anybody can stand up and make a motion to amend something that's going into your Book of Common Prayer and your Commemoration of Saints." I said, "Welcome to the Episcopal Church." That's kind of how we roll. We believe that all persons have a role in the life and governance of the church. And we believe with equal clergy and lay folks in the House of Deputies, and with the facts that the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops have to agree on things, on this layering of oversight and giving everyone a voice and a say in the church. So that's how it happens. It gets put to General Convention, and then it needs to get passed, and then it needs to get passed again. To be added to the calendar of saints requires 2 consecutive General Conventions. Just one won't do it. You have to go through the whole process a second time, 3 years later. So from start to finish, it can take up to 3, maybe 6 years to add a commemoration to the calendar of the Episcopal Church. So that's what we have. If you want to ask, where do the saints come from in the Episcopal Church? They come from us. They come from local commemoration. They come from people who are lifted up as having exemplary, holy lives of discipleship. There's no one promulgating or proclaiming them anywhere. It's local people who lift someone up, who then get lifted up to the next level and then make it to our General Convention where everyone has a say in determining if this person's life does indeed warrant the kind of commemoration on the calendar of the Church. Well, that's it for this video series as we wind Lent down. Thank you all. Thank you all for watching. Please go to our resource page. You can find directions to that from our website, where I'll have a link to this video and also have some discussion questions for you as you watch the video and then maybe want to talk about. Stay tuned as well as we move through this time in the life of the Church. After the Easter season, I'll be doing some more videos around Bible study and trying to come up with a more interactive way to do this. Thank you all. Take care of yourselves. Be safe. And God bless.